To start with, we're going to sew the pockets on our Phoebe Flares. So here I have the two front sections, right side up, and I'm going to take the pocket bag and place it on top of the front section, right sides together, along that pocket opening. So I'll do the same on the other side just to make sure that I'm keeping everything nice and symmetrical. So now I'm going to sew along that curved pocket opening, which is also known as a cutaway pocket. When I'm sewing, I like to do a technique that's called chaining on, just to make sure that I'm keeping everything the right way up. So I'm going to start off by sewing this side. Just be aware that if you're using slippery fabrics like I am with this is a crepe, that what can happen is it can stretch along here. So just, you want to hold it to make sure it doesn't stretch along that curve, which is slightly off grain. I back tack, and then I take the other half of the front and I'm just going to carry on along this seam. So back tacking, matching the sides and the curves to stop it from stretching. And sewing along that edge. When I finish that, I snip that join, trim the threads that I started from where I started, and then, so here you can see I've sewn that seam. We're going to open the pocket bag out, going away from the seam allowance like that, and then I'm going to edge stitch, catching the seam allowance on that pocket bag edge. So again, I'm just going to chain on. Chaining on is a great technique because it allows you to save thread and it just creates a really sort of fast workflow. So I'm sewing a couple of millimeters from the edge of the seam. My seam allowance is underneath the pocket bag, and I'm just using my hands to open out the seam as I'm sewing along. Coming to the end, little back tack, trim the thread from the other side, place it down. I've got the pocket bag on top and there's my seam allowance. I'm going to open out the pocket bag over the seam allowance and carry on that edge stitching. By doing it this way, you're making sure that you actually are sewing your seam allowance on the edge stitching to the pocket bag and not accidentally to the front and ending up with effectively top stitching. So take that out from the machine, trim that edge, and you can see here I have edge stitched onto the pocket bag, and there's my seam allowance caught with the edge stitching towards the pocket bag. So now I'm going to give that a press. I'll press it flat and then I'll press it with the pocket bag on the inside, and that edge stitching allows the seam to sort of naturally roll towards the back so that from the front I'm going to have a really nice sharp edge. So I'm just going to press that. So here you can see I've pressed the edge of the cutaway pocket, and on the right side I've got a beautiful crisp edge. Some people would trim that seam allowance now, but as you can see it's sitting beautifully and flat, and I don't like to trim away the seam allowance on the inside because I feel like this helps support that edge. So next we're going to fold the pocket bag in half, right sides together, and I'm just going to sew across the bottom edge of the pocket bag. I like to sew from the cut edge towards the fold because that ensures a good even finish. So back tacking at each end. Again, I'm going to chain on, so I'm going to take the other side. So the pocket bag is sitting flat on the inside, fold it over, and I'm just going to sew from the cut edge towards the fold. snip the join from the chaining on. And if I hold that up, you can see, this is very floppy fabric, that I've sewn across that bottom edge. Now I'm going to overlock that edge. If you are wanting to be a bit more fancy, say you were making this in a silk and you wanted a more beautiful finish, you could also do a French seam on this bottom edge of the pocket as well. Okay, so now I have overlocked the bottom edge of my pocket bag, and just a word on finishes. I prefer to do an overlocked edge on a fine fabric rather than a French seam, because even though a French seam is technically more beautiful, it also adds a bit more bulk, so this creates a flatter seam along that hip line. So now what I'm going to do is I've marked a notch on the waistline of the front, and I've got my notch to show the fold on my pocket bag. So I line those two up and fold the pocket bag over at that notch, pop a pin in where the pocket bag meets the cutaway, come around to the side seam and line up those pocket edges with the cutaway along the side seam, pop a pin in so that it's all nice and flat. I prefer to do this before pressing this fold, because that way I know that I'm getting a really nice crisp edge and then the fold will sit nicely. So now I'm going to sew that. Just stay stitching from the side seam and along the waist, just along that pocket bag. So there you can see I've sewn up the side seam, and I've sewn the whole way along the waist, because that just stops the waist from stretching. Not that it should, but sometimes it does, and it's just a little precaution. Now I'm going to sew the other side. So here you can see now I've pressed that edge of the pocket bag. It's nice and sharp. The whole thing is sitting beautifully flat, and if I turn that over to the right side, you can see I've got that lovely crisp edge on the cutaway. So now it's time to sew the side seams. So I've got the front right way up. I take the back section and put them right sides together along that side seam, which is short because it's going to have an insert, and I'm going to sew along the side seam, and then I need to overlock it. So I'm sewing, starting from the bottom edge, back tacking, matching it up, going along the side seam, and again I'm going to chain on. So now I've got the other half, and placing the back on top of the front, right sides together, matching the side seam, Now that I've finished that, I'm going to overlock the side seam, and I'm going to press the seam towards the back. So here I have overlocked the side seam and pressed it towards the back. By pressing it towards the back, it allows the pocket bag to sit nice and flat. In addition, I have prepped my pattern piece by snipping into the corners as marked on the pattern. If you haven't snipped it, you can actually work it out as well by drawing on the seam allowances using an erasable pen. Always check that the pen will disappear with heat before you actually draw it onto your actual fabric, because sometimes it doesn't. But what you can do is, if you are unsure, you simply draw on the seam allowance, which is 1 centimetre, like so. Draw in an angle going up towards the corner of the seam allowance, and you just snip towards that edge like so, and that will open out. So you want to really keep it about 1 millimetre or 2 from the actual edge of the seam allowance to give yourself room to pivot when we come to that point. And if we look at this from the right side, we can see we've got a beautiful smooth side seam and cutaway pocket ready for the insertion. So now we're going to work on the insertion. So take your rectangle, and you've got on the top edge a snip marking the center. So we're going to set our sewing machine to the largest stitch, and we're going to sew 2 rows of stitching along this top edge. So don't back tack, because you need to be able to pull on these threads to draw it back. So I start about 1 centimetre in. I'm just going to hold my threads to stop them from pulling back in and potentially making a little nest. I'm stopping about 1 centimetre from the edge, pulling the tails of the thread out and cutting them, leaving myself about 10 centimetres. Now I'm going to sew another row about 2 millimetres from the other edge. Pulling that out, leaving tails again. Now I'm ready to gather these 2 rows of stitching, but what I like to do is, so that I don't lose my notch for the centre, I mark it by putting the pin through with a sort of double insertion so that it doesn't fall out while I'm pulling on those threads. Now it can help to do a tester on your scrap piece with your sewing machine. On this sewing machine, if I pull the top 2 threads, it gathers nicely, but normally it should be the bottom threads that you pull, but all machines have their little quirks. So just gently slide the fabric along the thread. So rather than pulling the threads, you're really sort of sliding the fabric to create the gathers. So do a little bit from one end and a little bit from the other end, just to get those gathers nice and even. So what we're doing is we're gathering this fabric to measure 20 centimetres. So what I like to do is sort of get an idea of my 20 centimetres first, or sort of pulling it in, sort of just guesstimating it. Then I take a ruler and I line up those edges on the ruler, and I can see that just needs to be gathered a little bit more, so I'll pull it from both ends like so, and then check that. Yep, and that measures 20 centimetres. So then what I like to do is just knot those thread ends off so that those gathers don't come undone. Don't do it too tight, because otherwise you'll pull in your seam allowance as well. So once I've done that, you can see at the moment the gathers are uneven. So now I just slide that along, and I know that the gathers aren't going to fall apart at all and slide off the end because I've knotted them. And just make sure they're nice and even all along the edge. That looks really pretty. Okay, so now I'm going to do the same to the other side. Okay, so now I have gathered both top edges of my gathered inserts. So here I've got my gathered insert and the pants. So first of all, I'm going to match the side seam with that center notch on the gathered insert. Now in some ways it feels logical to sew the gathered insert on top, but really what we want to do is have the gathered insert underneath and the pants on top, so that when we come to pivot at that corner, we've got our snip on top. So you can pop a pin in at that point, then match down the side of the leg, like so. And if you do this on a table, you're keeping it nice and flat. It can make it easier, especially with a slippery fabric. So I've got my trousers on top of the gathered insert, and I'm going to start from the hem. Put your stitch length back to a normal stitch length, not the gathering stitch length. Start off by sewing a little back tack and sewing up the side. Okay, so now I'm coming up to where my snip is. So I'm going to take the pin out. I'm going to arrange the gathered insert underneath, keeping that nice and flat. And I'm going to keep the trousers flat up to that side seam, like so. And I'm going to sew up to the snip. This can feel a little bit fiddly, particularly if you've got the pin in, so I'm actually going to take that pin out at the side seam because it prevents me from actually manipulating the fabric the way I need to. Pins are sometimes a hindrance. So sewing up to the snip, keeping nice and flat. And I'm at the snip, I've got the needle down, I'm going to lift the foot and I'm going to pivot, and I'm going to move that fabric out of the way of the trouser, keeping this gathered insert nice and flat. Should actually have left the pin in my center of the gathered inserts rather than taking it all out. So now I'm going to place the trousers on top, keeping it nice and flat on top of the gathers and just pressing the gathers down, and I'm going to sew along that top edge of the insert where the gathers are, along to the other snip. So I'm just opening out the gathers and keeping them nice and flat, matching my snip, and you can see the snip easily because I've got the seam allowance drawn on there. Up to the snip, needle goes down, lift the foot to pivot, turn everything, turn this top layer out of the way, and you can see that underneath I've got my gathered insert, and now that's straight with that seam towards me, and then I have the trousers legs on top lined up, and I'm going to sew back down the other long edge. Back tack when you get to the end. So if we have a look at this on the top, we can see that the gathered insert is sewn in, And if you look closely, you can see where I have sewn up to that snip, and the snip has opened out. So where before it was close together like that, because I've pivoted it, it's come open. So now I just need to overlock around all of those edges and press the seam towards the trouser and up towards the pocket. Now I'm going to sew the other side. Okay, and here I have pressed the gathered insert, so you can see I've got these nice square corners sitting beautifully with the pocket. And from the wrong side, okay, this is very floppy fabric, you can see I've pressed the seam allowance towards the sides of the trousers and up, so that the pocket bag is sitting in line with the seam allowance of that gathered insert. It's very slippery, it's sliding off my table like so. Okay, so now we need to sew the inside leg seam. So we're going to fold it right sides together, matching the crutch point and the hem, and we're just going to sew down this inside seam. So back tucking and sew all the way down. And I'm just going to chain on to do the other side. So now I'm going to overlock those seams and press them towards the back. Next we're going to sew the crutch seam. So we're going to take one trouser leg and have it the wrong way out. Then we're going to take the other trouser leg and turn it the right way out, and the one that's the right way out we're going to slide inside the one that's the wrong way out. Then we're going to match the crutch seam, if I can find it in here. There it is. So I'm going to pop a pin at the crutch seam. I'm going to match the centre front and the centre back at the waistline. Popping pins in there, and then I'm just going to sew that whole U-shaped crutch curve. So back tucking at the start, tuck at the end, take it out of the machine, and we just need to overlock that crutch curve and give it a press. Next we're going to sew the waistband if you're making these into pants. Alternatively, if you're making this into a jumpsuit using one of the add-ons, for instance you want to add the Phoebe bib and tucker top to these flares, which looks fantastic, you can add that on now, or in this case I'm just making trousers, so we're going to use the waistband. So I've got my 2 waistband pieces. I'm going to fold them right sides together, and I'm going to sew the centre back seam. So I'm lining that up. Now for the waistband, what I want to do is leave a little opening in the centre back seam of the inside part of the waistband so that I can thread the elastic through at the end. So I'm going to sew back tack, so about 1.5 centimetres back tack, lift the needle up and just drag that over, leaving an opening, back tack, and sew down and back tack. Then I'm going to chain on and do the other side, and I'm just going, this will be the outer part of the waistband, so I'm just going to sew the whole way down, back tacking at each end. Snip those threads, and you can see here if I snip the thread of the opening, I've left a gap that I can thread my elastic through. Now this doesn't need overlocking because it's concealed, but I do need to press that seam so it's open, and if I open that out you can also see that gap that I've left for the inside of the waistband. Okay, now I've pressed the seams of my waistband and I'm going to put them together, right sides together. Put that under my sewing machine and I'm going to start sewing from the centre back. I have marked little notches in the waistband marking the quarter point, so the side seam and the centre fronts. So I'm going to start off sewing in back tack, holding that firmly, matching my quarter points and just sewing the whole way around. Just over sewing and back tacking when I reach the end. Then I take that out, trim my threads. Now I'm going to edge stitch because that just really helps create a nice rollover when you are wanting to press. So I'm going to turn that over so I'm on the right side. The seam allowance is facing towards the lining part and I can see the lining because I've got the opening. And I'm going to just edge stitch that seam allowance to the lining side of my waistband. So I'm opening out the fabric, so I'm pulling it on each side to make sure that there's no pleat that's forming and to keep it nice and flat. So rather than stretching in front and behind, I'm stretching sideways. Lots of stray threads. Back to my starting point, over sew a centimetre, back tack and take it out. Trim those threads. Okay, so now I'm going to press it so I've got a nice smooth edge on top, and you'll find that because of that edge stitching that's really easy to do. Okay, the waistband is now ready to be sewn onto the trousers, but what I like to do is stay stitch or baste the edge of the waistband before I sew it on, because that stops it from slippering, particularly if you're using a fabric like a drapey crepe or rayon. So I'm just going to whiz around that edge. Okay, next I'm just going to pop a pin in to the notches where my quarter points are, so I can match them with the side seam and the centre front and the centre back of my trousers. I'll take my trousers. I've turned my trousers the right way out, so I'm going to just turn them over so I've got the centre back on top, and I'm going to put the waistband on right sides together, matching the centre back and making sure that I've got that opening on the lining of the waistband not facing the trousers. So I'm going to put a pin in there, pin the side seam, pin the centre front, and pin the other side seam, and I'm ready to sew on the waistband. So I'm going to start from the centre back. I've got my elastic here, it's 4 centimetres wide, and I can just check that, yep, in fact my seam allowance is looking good. Sometimes with drapey fabrics it can shift and move a bit. Okay, so we're going to sew it all the way around, back tacking, holding it nice and firm between the quarter points, matching all those edges, and sewing all the way around. Tack when you finish and over sew. Okay, that's ready to be overlocked. Now I've overlocked the waistband, so I'm going to edge stitch the seam allowance of the waistband onto the body of the trousers because I think that looks nice. This is an optional step, but I like to do it. So I've got the seam allowance towards the body of the trousers, and I'm just edge stitching nice and close to the waistband, pulling the fabric on each side to prevent a little pleat forming, and I prefer to do this before ironing because sometimes ironing can actually force a pleat. Oh, lost my snips. So overstow at the point where I started and back tack and take that out. Pick up my snips. Like so. And I can give that a press so you can see that edge stitching. Now I'm ready to thread the elastic through the waistband. I've measured the elastic to fit comfortably on my waist, so I like to have soft elastic so I don't pull it tight, I just make it sit nice and comfortably with a 1 centimetre overlap. Then I'm taking this tool for threading through elastic. You could also use a safety pin. Make sure it's pulled down nice and firmly, and starting from that opening in the centre back, I'm just going to thread the elastic into that opening. So my opening is slightly smaller than my elastic, so I just fold that in half to get it started. push it along and pull that in, and then once it's sort of started going in, I flatten it out. I'm not worrying about those gathers at this point. All I'm concerned about is that the elastic hasn't twisted. Now I'm going to overlap the two pieces of elastic, and I'm going to sew down and create a sort of Z shape or an N shape with that overlap. This doesn't have to be a beautiful piece of sewing, it's just holding the elastic together nice and flat. Okay, so then we're just going to slide that into the opening so that then we can arrange the gathers. Pushing it in, sort of pulling on the elastic just to snap it into place. Ooh, not for the camera. Sliding those gathers evenly around. Now I could just leave the elastic like this, that looks nice. If I was doing that, I would probably just do a little stay stitch on the elastic on the side seams and the centre back at the seam, just ditch stitch in there, just to stop the elastic rolling when you take the trousers off and on. But one of the things I also like to do is top stitch my elastic, so I'm just give that a good pull so the gathers are really evenly spaced. Then I'm going to sew a row on top and a row below of top stitching, which will also hold those gathers in place and look really pretty. So I'm going to sew this on the right side because obviously I want the stitching to look the best on the right side. So I'm going to start on the top edge, the centre back tack a few stitches, hold the waistband really firmly, stretching in front and behind, pausing and sewing. Reaching where I started from, over sewing by centimetre and back tacking. Then I'm just going to lift the needle and the foot and come down, and I'm just going to start sewing the same distance on the other side of the waistband. So back tacking and sewing all the way around, so stretching it out, sewing, pausing, stretching and sewing. Back to where I started from and snipping those threads. So I could sew the opening closed on the inside of that waistband, but I find that with the top stitching you can't see it, so it's fine. Okay, so that's how the top stitching looks on the waistband. It still looks a bit bubbly, but when I give that a press, it's going to look beautiful. So here is the waistband, all pressed. And how beautiful do those gathers look now they're ironed. I really love how these soft drapey fabrics look with gathers, and they're just beautiful. Okay, so now we're ready to do the hems. So the pattern allows you to choose the length of hem that you want. So with a soft drapey fabric like this, I like to have a really deep hem because it helps give the garment weight and body, and so it sits beautifully. So what I like to do to make sure that's nice and even, and also to keep it quick because I like sewing fast, is I'm going to use a heat erasable pen. Like I said before, you want to make sure that you check that it does in fact erase with heat. So I've overlocked the bottom edge. I'm measuring up, in this case, 10 centimeters because I want that really deep hem, marking it at intervals, and then I'm going to just draw a line for that 10 centimeters. I flip it over. Drawing in the line, like so, and then I can sort of swing that round and just join the sections that are missing. This is particularly useful on a fabric that is so drapey as well. So I'm going to start from the inside leg seam, and I'm going to turn that up at that fold, and I'm just going to sew right in the middle of the overlocking. Now you can see I don't even really need to pin this because I've got that line drawn on, and I'm just going to sew between the sections. So I'm coming back to the point where I started, over sew by a centimetre, back tack and take it out. Snip the threads. And you can see that because I've drawn that line on and it's sitting right on that edge, even if it didn't fully disappear, it wouldn't matter because it's actually on the crease of that fold. And there I have my beautiful deep hem. So now I'm going to sew the other side. So now I've sewn both hems and I just need to give them a press and wear them. So here it is, my finished Phoebe Flares. I think it's worked beautifully in this pink crepe, loving the gathered inserts and the way they just give the legs that flare and they just flow beautifully. Would also look lovely in a linen, I think, and the stiffer fabric would also work really well. I'm wearing it with my Eva tee, the long sleeve version with button tabs. So this outfit really feels like secret pyjamas, but it is sophisticated enough that you could wear it out for lunch or dinner. It's easy to accessorise, just chuck a scarf on and you've got another really great look. So, have fun with your make, can't wait to see what you do. Don't forget when you post things on Instagram, @PatternUnion, #Phoebe Flares, #Phoebe Collection.